Okay.
Right. Welcome to everyone. Thanks for joining us. My name is Michelle Jordan, and I'm the president of the League of Women Voters of Evanston. Tonight, we have an informative program with outstanding speakers. In the audience tonight, we have league members, city staff, members of the LWVE Regional Housing Coalition, fair housing advocates, and interested community members. For over 100 years, the League has served as a trusted source of accurate and important information. The foundation of this trust is that the League is nonpartisan. We neither support nor oppose candidates or parties. The League does take positions, however, on issues, but only after focused study and reaching member consensus. Our program this evening is part of one local League focus this year on fair housing enforcement, for which we do have a position. The position states in part that we support strong and effective enforcement of all fair housing laws. Jennifer, would you please introduce the speakers?
Sure. We are really pleased this evening to have two very impressive speakers with us to help us better understand housing discrimination and segregation. Maria Kreisen is a liberal arts and sciences distinguished professor in the Department of Sociology at the University of Illinois, Chicago. Professor Kreisen has spent decades teaching, researching, and writing about residential segregation and racial attitudes. Her 2017 award-winning book with Kyle Crowder, Cycle of Segregation, Social Processes and Residential Stratification, draws on in-depth interviews, large-scale survey data, and previously published research to propose an innovative framework for understanding the causes of racial residential segregation. Kreisen's writing has been published in a wide array of conventional academic outlets as well as non-academic publications. Allison Bethel joined UIC John Marshall Law School in 2008 as a clinical professor of law and director of the Fair Housing Legal Clinic. She's a Chicago native, received her bachelor's degree from Northwestern University and her law degree from the University of Florida. Following law school, she worked in the private sector and then later joined the Florida Attorney General's office. As director of civil rights in that office, Ms. Bethel litigated landmark civil rights cases, drafted and successfully lobbied for historic amendments to Florida's Civil Rights Act, and developed innovative educational and training programs. Maria and Allison both have been recognized with many awards, and honestly, I wish I had time to read more of their bios because they're outstanding. But I think we should hear directly from them instead. So, Maria, I'm going to turn it over to you to get us started.
Great. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to be here. Well, I'm in my house, but I'm excited to be on the Zoom experience with you all tonight. I'm going to start my presentation. I have 3 questions for you to think about while I get my technology under control. The first question is, I want you to think about how you came to live in the neighborhood or community that you live in. The second question I want you to think about is, what perceptions or impressions did you have of that place before you moved in? And the third question I want you to think about, hopefully it's not too late in the evening, you can't think about 3 questions, is where did you get those perceptions from? What was your source of information about the place that you ended up moving into? You no doubt have a question for me, which is, what does this have anything to do with housing discrimination? So I am going to hopefully answer that. Well, it has to do, those 3 questions have to do with the larger social phenomenon that is one of the defining features of the Chicago metropolitan area and Evanston's as well, which is racial residential segregation. So in my part of this evening's program, I'm going to start with the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And I'm going to trick you a little bit and make you think I'm going to talk about discrimination, but I'm actually not. Instead, I'm going to offer a framework in which you can situate my co-presenters' remarks, which will dive into the advertised theme of this evening's session, which is discrimination. And that's because I turn it over to the real on-the-ground expert. So in the debate leading up to the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, one of the co-sponsors, Senator Edward Brooks of Massachusetts, offered a concise summary of the then current state of segregation. Quote, "We make 2 general assertions. 1, that American cities and suburbs suffer from galloping segregation, a malady so widespread and so deeply embedded in the national psyche that many Americans, Negroes as well as whites, have come to regard it as a natural condition. And two, that the prime carrier of galloping segregation has been the federal government. First, it built the ghettos, then it locked the gates. Now it appears to be fumbling for the key. Nearly everything the government touches turns to segregation, and the government touches nearly everything, end quote. So some things have changed. The Fair Housing Act outlawed discrimination, though as Professor Bessel will explain to you, it's not disappeared. There's been some changes in white racial attitudes. There's been an emergence of a significant Black middle class, and populations in most metro areas have become more diverse, and stable, diverse neighborhoods are less rare than they used to be. But much of what Senator Brooks said remains true today. Segregation is virtually unchanged, especially in places with substantial Black populations like Chicago, Detroit, Milwaukee. Racial and ethnic groups still remain in and move between largely separate sets of neighborhoods, which means that the advantages that accrue to white neighborhoods and disadvantages borne by Black neighborhoods are passed on from one generation to the next, and the government is still fumbling for the keys. For decades, racist policies and practices at the local, state, and federal and industry level cemented segregation into our city. These were things like redlining, public housing siting, highway construction, racially restrictive covenants, block busting, predatory lending, land sale contracts. All of these things and many others laid the foundation for the separate and unequal places that define the region today. We socially engineered segregation. So when you think about how you ended up living where you did, remember that you were impacted directly or indirectly by the consequences of policies like these and practices that I didn't mention that set the stage in which you made your housing decision or move. But what else causes segregation other than these policies from the past? For the past 5 or so decades, academics and policymakers have focused on 3 explanations for segregation. The first is that segregation comes about because of economic differences between racial groups. The second is that segregation comes about because people simply prefer to live with people like themselves. And third, segregation comes about because of persistent discrimination in the housing market, despite the fact that it's been made illegal. So that's the big picture. That's the decades, literally thousands of articles that have been written with that framework in mind. But I want to go back to the question I asked you at the top of my talk. How did you end up living where you did? Quite apart from the stage that was set by decades of history, what was your process like? This question is at the core of my book, Cycle of Segregation, co-authored with Kyle Crowder. And when Kyle and I started writing our book about the causes of segregation, we asked ourselves a simple question: what have we been missing for these many decades? What we came to realize is that for the literally thousands of studies done about segregation, social scientists rarely ask the seemingly simple question: how do people end up living where they do? By asking it this way, instead of asking why do we have segregation, but how do people end up living where they do, our focus turns to understanding how economics, discrimination, and preferences shape how we end up living where we do. In short, how they shape people's housing search processes. And importantly, this new framing forced us to ask what other social factors shape how we end up living where we do, and more to the point, in a way that might perpetuate segregation. With this new lens in mind, we turned our attention to the perceptions and knowledge people have about the neighborhoods and communities where they might live. So think back to the second question I asked you. Before you moved into the neighborhood or community you live in now, what was your impression of the place? What were the good and the bad things you knew about it? And importantly, once you have those things in mind, think about the third question. How did you come to know what you knew about this place? What was your source of information? My suspicion is that when you were thinking where your information came from, you came up with some version of what Aaron, one of the people we interviewed for our study, said when we asked him this question. How did you know about all these things that you told us about? We asked him questions about all kinds of places in Chicago. His answer was, from what I see, mostly the news, my friends, I don't know, I don't write it down where I get it from. It just kind of compiles in this big old noggin right here. Or to use sociology speak, where did he get his information from? Where did you probably get your information from? Social networks, our lived experiences, and the media. In our book, we suggest that these are the mundane and often overlooked things that shape what we think of communities and what they're like, And eventually, it is this information, perceptions, and knowledge that helps shape where you end up living. And if you think about the fact that thousands of Chicago area residents move or don't move every year, and that in the aggregate, the outcome of those searches is the map I showed you earlier of a segregated Chicago, well, you can see how these things matter. And this is at the core of a cycle of segregation. Why? Because the information that you have about places is both a result of segregation, and it also helps to perpetuate it. Because we live in a segregated city, our social networks tend to be more segregated, our lived experiences and the media become racialized sources of information that eventually funnel us to make segregative moves without even realizing it. So let's unpack these three sources briefly so you can start to think a little bit more critically about this. One source of information is the news, or more broadly, the media, which includes all kinds of sources. It's local TV news. That's probably the first thing that came to your mind when I said media tells us about cities and communities and neighborhoods. But it's also newspaper ads, the stores that are being advertised, the kinds of stores that are in a community send us messages about what the community is like. Classified ads are the equivalent today that convey the kinds of jobs that are available in a community. Song lyrics about the South Side of Chicago, movies set in communities in the suburbs of Chicago, TV shows set in Chicago neighborhoods, social media, blogs, neighborhood listservs. The list goes on. And they all convey impressions and information about places that people absorb, and not all of it is race neutral. Just check out the local TV news or your next door neighbor app, and you'll see what I mean. A second source of information that we have about places is your social networks. Usually we think of social networks like family as shaping our housing decisions because we want to live near them, or perhaps we don't want to live near them, or because they may have literally found us the vacant home or available apartment that we moved into. But it's also true that information about places, our perceptions, what we know about communities, comes through those networks. When people make moves, think of the last time you made a move. You often ask your family, your friends, your neighbors, your coworkers, and lots of other people for their advice. You say, where are the good and bad places to live? So we might ask them directly. But even if we don't ask them directly, we're still gathering impressions of places through our social networks because we visit them where they live sometimes. Or even if we don't visit them where they live, simply knowing where they live, we often make assumptions based on what we know about them, their race, their education, their income, about what that place is probably like. And because our social networks are often racially segregated, because we live in a segregated city, they become a reciprocal and deeply ingrained factor in the cycle of segregation. But of course, our information and perceptions of places are also shaped simply by living life. So these are the neighborhoods we're exposed to when we do the things we do every day. The places we've lived throughout our lives, the commute we take to work or school, the traveling around we do because we install cable TV for a living, the communities we visit taking kids to soccer games or wrestling matches. These are the places we routinely go, but they're also the chance encounter that we have with places. And again, those routine and not so routine experiences in a segregated region like Chicago tend to be racially distinct. So the information, perceptions, and impressions of places comes from racially informed sources, funneling us to places that are segregated. And segregation thus begets segregation. The book talks about a lot more details, but one last question I have for you. During a housing search, do we have, acquire, and process information like a computer? In a word, no. First, two reasons, at least. Whereas computers can hold lots and lots of information, we can't possibly have information about every possible neighborhood or community or vacant home or apartment that we could live in. There are places we've never heard of, and it's hard, though not impossible, to move to a place you've never heard of. We call these blind spots. We call them racial blind spots because people tend to know about places where their own racial group predominates. And this is especially true for whites. So these blind spots, broadly understood, can contribute to segregation. But we also don't assemble and process information like a computer. We don't create Excel spreadsheets and dump all the data about all the places we could live into them and use a formula to identify the one place that scores highest on our I should live here scale. We could do this, but we don't. We use shortcuts. And the shortcuts we found that best describes how our respondents that we talked to for our book talked about their housing search process is the best Q shortcut. With just one bit of information about a place, people fill in lots of details and they can draw what they think of as a quite complete picture of a place, even about places they've never been. Let me show you an example. At the time of our interview, Tom had lived in the Chicago area for just a few months. He pieced together an entire portrait of Waukegan and Gurnee based on a trip to Six Flags a few months earlier. Now, those of us on the call probably know that why not lump Waukegan and Gurnee together into the same place. So that was his first interesting observation. But nevertheless, he described these two communities as follows. He said, they seem like very settled places, very suburban, very calm, subdued. I don't know. I don't really know if they're upscale, but there's tons of shopping out there. The interviewer said, what's your impression of who lives out there? He said, I think it's mostly like people in their 30s, 40s, 50s who have families and want to live somewhere that's a bit more quiet. I don't get the impression that's a very diverse neighborhood, so it's mostly white. I mean, it's a nice place to visit for Six Flags and for shopping. I get the impression the schools there are nice. The crime is probably pretty low. It's not as densely populated. That's a lot to get from a shopping trip or a trip to an amusement park about a community, making all kinds of assumptions about school quality, crime levels, and all that based on one brief trip out there. So if we put these things together, our argument in a nutshell is that individuals use what they assume about the racial composition of an area, which may be derived from our social networks, our lived experiences in the media, to make further assumptions about other characteristics of the neighborhood. In our interviews, white residents tended to assume that areas with relatively high Black populations have high levels of crime, poor property values, and ineffective schools, while simultaneously reporting that they knew little about these places. Similarly, Black residents talked about spending little time in and knowing little about areas with high white populations, but they assumed that these places would be unaffordable or unwelcoming to Black residents. So these social networks, lived experiences, and the media join the traditional big three causes of segregation, discrimination, preferences, and economics to shape how people end up living where they do. They're all interrelated and interconnected as implied by this figure. So segregation begets segregation. Let me close with another quote from the testimony during the debate around the 1968 Fair Housing Act. Quote, the ghetto is self-perpetuating, for by separating the white child from the Negro child, we hand on to both our own dear delusions of race. We are now trapped in a situation where we must push for a miscellany of torturous techniques, from pairing to busing, designed to integrate schools which serve segregated neighborhoods, both Black and white. These schools must pretend that Americans live in one world and not two, but the children know better because they know their neighborhoods. The bus from the Negro ghetto in Evanston, Illinois, comes every morning to Lincolnwood Elementary School, and the white children on the bus on the playground shout, "Here comes the colored bus." Neighborhood segregation is thus the sour grape that sets each new generation's teeth on edge. Right now, we're creating another generation of Americans committed in their bones to segregation, not because we're formally teaching it. In many homes and schools, we're teaching just the opposite, but because we're living it. Unfortunately, in too many communities, with a few minor adjustments for the terminology people use to refer to people, this description rings true 50 years later. The hope is that by shining a spotlight on these hidden in plain sight causes of the perpetuation of segregation, we're drawing attention to more tools that we could use to disrupt it. There's no silver bullet that will end segregation and the inequities that flow from it. We need to start pulling on some of these levers in deliberate ways in order to move the proverbial needle on this profound inequality that permeates many of our cities, including Chicago. So my last question before I turn it over to Professor Bethel is, which lever might you be able to pull? If you want to learn more about the topic, you can check out the longer version of this argument in our book. But I, recommend it for nighttime reading when you're feeling like you need to go to sleep. But now let me turn it over to Professor Bethel to really focus in on the question of discrimination, but hopefully you'll ultimately see how it ties together. unmute yourself, Professor Bethel.
Oh my gosh, I've been having trouble with that mute button all evening. Good evening, and thank you so much, Dr. Creason, for that presentation. I am really thrilled to be here this evening too. I feel like I'm coming home. Of course, I lived in Evanston for 4 years. While I was in college, I took a gap year, as they now call it, and I lived on 910 Main Street. I worked at the Marshall Fields that used to be there. I actually, when I left and returned to Chicago following law school and such, I considered coming back home to Evanston to settle. So anyway, I really feel delighted to be here and to participate in this conversation. And I think Dr. Creason really has at least some of the keys to the solution for this problem, this malady, if you will, as she described it, of segregation that we have here in America. Certainly, while I'm going to go through a little bit of the law and the evolution of the law and the enforcement and some areas that trending issues that we have now, certainly the law alone is not the key to the resolution of this problem. We need to do exactly what Dr. Creason is talking about in terms of changing hearts and minds and perspectives on neighborhoods and how we live together. I've got a few slides here. I'm going to try to start with are you seeing my slides now? Great. As Jennifer said, I direct a fair housing legal clinic at UIC Law School. We used to be John Marshall Law School, if you're familiar with that, and we merged with UIC in 2019, which gave us the opportunity, among other things, to work with fine professors and other people like Dr. Creason really on this whole issue of discrimination and such. You know, Maria went through a little bit of the history of the Fair Housing Act, or a little bit of the history of the legal landscape of where we were before the passage of the act. It was not good. There were numerous government and private policies that helped foster and nourish and create the separate and unequal communities that we have today. Many of those practices, you'll see as we talk, still exist today, maybe with some tweaks and turns and twists, but essentially still the same. One of the things, though, that has happened in recent times is that we are looking where we are at with fair housing, and we're looking at it from two perspectives. When the act was passed, it actually had two main purposes for it. One was to eliminate segregation, basically to stop these discriminatory practices that Dr. Creason was talking about: redlining, blockbusting, flat out lying about housing opportunities available to minorities. But the other purpose, this number 2 down here, promote integrated communities, this was largely overlooked and at least not given a lot of attention until, I want to say, about 2015, when some cases were decided, which I won't go into in detail, but in essence, they began to look at this question of what can we do and what should we be doing to promote the integration mandate of the Fair Housing Act. And certainly one thing we need to do, and we can do, is address some of the issues that Maria raised, both in terms of media, what we are saying about communities, where we position ourselves, right, to learn the information and such about our communities. And so this promote integrated communities piece is something I want you to think about, because we're going to come back to it at the end of my presentation and talk a little bit about that in Evanston. But, you know, because I'm a law professor, I've got to give you, I know it's mean, but I've got to give you a little bit of a quiz on the Fair Housing Act, because I did see that this was an issue that you all were, you know, embracing on your agenda this year. And so my first question for you, and I'm going to ask that you maybe drop your answers in the chat. And Jennifer, can you help me out here and just tell me what you're seeing in the chat, because I'm not able to really see the chat. But I've got here, which categories of people do you think are protected by the federal fair housing laws? Recovering addicts, abuse survivors, persons with criminal records, persons receiving temporary rental assistance from the pandemic, immigrants, or one of the catch-alls, all of the above except E, or all of the above item G. Jennifer, what answers are we getting? None? Everybody's
Not seeing anything yet, but
no, we're not seeing anything.
okay.
Well,
So we
you know,
G.
G, all of the above. And you know what? That is the one answer we needed, because of course that's the correct answer, would be G. And what this question is really designed to get you to thinking about, or really appreciating, right, is the fact that the act is, in terms of classes of people that it protects, it is much broader than many people realize. These 7 categories here: race, color, national origin, religion, these were in place at the beginning of the act when it was passed in 68. Sex came about and was added in 72, and then familial status and disability was added in 88. But what has happened since then is that we have recognized that policies and procedures and activities can have an impact on protected classes such that they can also come under these protections. What do I mean by that? Well, let's go back here. Recovering addicts are considered, if they're in recovery, they are considered persons with disabilities. And abuse survivors, because of the disparate impact on women, may be covered under the federal law. And persons with criminal records, again, because of the issues and disparate impacts with our criminal justice system, that can have a disparate impact on race and to some extent sex, in that Black males are often arrested and incarcerated at disparate numbers, and to some extent disabilities, right? People with mental disabilities are arrested and may face criminal penalties more often. So the categories of people may be broader than what you think about. And immigrants, not only may that come under the national origin protections, but the Fair Housing Act does not limit enforcement to just people that are citizens. You may be an immigrant, an undocumented person, even an illegal person, and still come within the coverage of the act. The federal protections are the minimum level of protections, and state and local laws may provide more protections. And of course, your Evanston ordinance provides more protections, including protections for persons based on their criminal history and to some extent their status as a victim of domestic violence. Criminal history, there are limitations on that, and there are exclusions on that. the main focus of that is that up until the passage of some of these laws like yours and the ones in Cook County, a person could be precluded from housing forever because of their criminal record. In fact, I had a case once where the application said you can't have been convicted of a crime in the last 100 years. 100 years. So that's an example, and my client actually did not come within that at all, but that's an example of a policy that is way too restrictive without considering the type of crime, what the person has done since then, rehabilitation, and all of that. And your ordinance, I might add, is really very broad and liberal. I thought it was really very expansive. Other protective classes under your ordinance include a source of income, which would include people receiving rental assistance, which and actually this category has just been added this year to the state law protections under the Fair Housing Act, and immigrants will be protected expressly under the Illinois Act beginning next year in 24. Okay, so my second quiz question: which of the following properties do you think are covered by the Federal Fair Housing Act? Again, just drop your answers in the chat. Vacation homes, nursing homes, dormitories, shelters, vacant land, none of the above, or all of the above. What do you think? Any answers there?
We're getting all of the above again.
Oh my gosh, I'm gonna have to give everybody an A, and there's my reputation is gonna be in the toilet. But you guys are right. You know, this slide was just designed to show you kind of again the breadth of these laws and to help you appreciate that today a lot of the issues that we're seeing in terms of what properties are included involve more temporary type housing. Things like sober homes, recovery homes, nursing homes, rehabilitation homes, Airbnbs, are those kind of covered? ADUs, auxiliary dwelling units, houseboats, these more temporary type dwellings. While they are going to be fact specific, for the most part, the courts have found them to be covered under the fair housing laws. And many of the local laws follow suit in that regard. There are a few exemptions, and we do see a lot of activity actually under this owner-occupied 4 buildings or less exemption. This is an exemption. It's really a very troubling exemption, and it's limited in many ways. And I have to say, when I read your ordinance, I didn't see that in there as an exemption. So I'm not 100% sure that that is contained in your Evanston ordinance. It is not in the Chicago ordinance. And the significance of that is that we are in Chicago able to go after these smaller owner-occupied buildings, even though they're exempt from the federal law. Because they're covered under the law, we're able to take action against them. And a lot of the housing stock in Chicago can be these smaller type of buildings. So it is really something that impacts particularly the rental market. And so what are some of the things that are illegal under the Fair Housing Act? Maria talked about a lot of them, and I want to just talk a little bit about them to help you appreciate how they present themselves in cases. So, for example, refusals to rent, we don't see as much blatant refusals as we used to see, but what we do see is conduct that amounts to a refusal through discouraging or misleading things. I give you an example. One thing we've been fighting in Chicago are income guidelines. Where the housing provider will say you need to have an income of 3 times the rent in order to rent this apartment. And of course, the problem is that often if you have 3 times the rent, you will not be able to qualify for the housing voucher and other government assistance. So that's an example of a policy that can have a disparate impact on voucher holders, depending on how those things are applied. Maria talked about redlining, which is an example of a refusal to rent, as well as imposing different terms and conditions. This is an example, of course, of some of the redlining in Evanston back in the day. And we still see redlining today. It's not done quite in the same way. In fact, what we're seeing now is digital redlining. There was a case recently against Redfin, which is an online real estate brokerage company. And the allegation was that they had a policy of not providing services to Black areas that were previously redlined. And the justification for the policy was that the properties there were so low in value because of discrimination, but they were so low in value that the agents couldn't make money there. So they just would not serve that area. And that's an example, I think, not only of digital redlining, drawing that same red line around the community and refusing to provide a service there. That is also an example of what Dr. Kreese and Maria was talking about in terms of attitudes, because when you're thinking of this area like that, like I can't make enough money from it, instead of saying, how might I, as a real estate professional, indeed, even as the government authority in that city, address this kind of practice in my community, because it's hurting the community. So these things that were happening back in '68 are still happening today, only in different ways. Another digital redlining case of interest might be the recent settlement with Facebook, where they were actually digitally steering. Steering is where you direct people based on their protected status to or away from a particular area. And Facebook was doing this through algorithms that would create a profile of you and what your interest was. Certainly, we saw in COVID how these redlined communities and these practices were basically killing people. These are maps showing and comparing. These are the areas that were redlined, and these are the life expectancy of the people in these areas are very, very low. Basically, it's killing people. I think one thing I want to kind of end us on, and then take your questions, is the advertising piece, because I think it ties in directly to some of the media comments that Maria was saying. This is an area that has been covered under the Fair Housing Act since the very beginning, but we have lost a lot of ground in this area as it relates to internet platforms. There has been the development of case law that essentially exempts internet platforms from portions of the Fair Housing Act, and this has allowed discriminatory statements, discouraging statements, and such to flourish and really kind of set us back as it relates to the environment that we're keeping and the messaging that we're giving about housing. What are some other topics that you want to be looking at this year? Well, this first bullet here, crime-free and nuisance ordinances. I don't know if you've heard about those. But these are ordinances that many cities and municipalities are passing that can be very detrimental to protective classes, depending on how they are enforced. These are ordinances, and sometimes they might even present themselves as an amendment to the lease in a rental community. But essentially, they require a landlord to evict a person or to take adverse action against a person. Hello, because they have called the police or emergency services, medical services to the community more than a specified number of times within a particular year. And these things can be discouraging for people. Victims of domestic violence can be discouraged from calling the police. It can discourage people in need of medical care for a disability or something like that from calling emergency services. So you need to be on the lookout for these because if they're not enforced properly and they're written poorly, it can result in homelessness for vulnerable populations. AI stands for artificial intelligence, which of course is all the rage these days. We could have a whole seminar on that and how those systems, while we think they're neutral, they can be very biased. It's garbage in, garbage out, and you really do have to watch what's going on there. And then finally, these last three things I think I've talked about a little bit. Appraisal bias, you probably, that's tied in actually with AI. It's where often properties in minority communities are lower valued because of the community that they're in. Changing hearts and minds. Remember how I started out and I was telling you about promoting integrated communities? This is what we're looking at doing by trying to change hearts and minds. This is what Dr. Creason was talking about. And HUD has come out with a rule that's called affirmatively furthering fair housing. And this rule is still actually kind of a little bit in the formation stage, but it is addressing issues of what communities like Evanston can do to improve the segregation that we're seeing. And then finally, this last bullet, commission initiated actions. I wanted to end on that because I want to really end with a charge to you. You know, most fair housing laws contain a provision that allows the governing authority, which in your case would be your commission, to initiate fair housing actions on their own, where they investigate and see a practice in their community that is discriminatory. This is one of the most effective ways to dismantle systemic segregation, as Dr. Creason was talking about. And this is an idea that I want to commit to you and your charge and the league, Jennifer, to consider as part of your efforts to promote integrated communities.
Thank you. So first, I'm going to apologize for mispronouncing last names. Maria, I apologize. And want to go to any questions, comments? Susan.
Hi there. Good evening, everyone. I think there are two issues here, and I live in Glenview, and I've lived in Wilmette as well. So there is the economic discrimination because of the property values, and you know, those are real. And the second part is, why would people want to live here? So Open Communities years ago did a survey of people people lived in the city of Chicago to talk about what they thought of these northern suburbs. And they said things like, I don't like the way they look at me. I don't feel safe there. I don't feel well regarded there. And so this is a chasm that is not easily broken. Okay. I grew up on the Chicago lawn. I lived in Hyde Park for a couple of years. Hyde Park is like a little island surrounded by the poorest communities in the city. My mother grew up in Gresham. My father grew up in Gage Park. So we're city people. But you know, these in terms of moving people from the city to the suburbs, they have to be comfortable. You know, they have to feel safe and welcomed. And I think that's where we're, you know, and redlining is still going on, but I think people need to feel welcomed. And we say we're welcoming communities, but we're not. And the housing prices are really, you know, they're difficult to overcome.
Yeah.
You know, the first ring suburbs, maybe it's a little better. The second ring suburbs, it's prohibitive. Like, you know, and the third ring suburbs had a different reason for bringing in people from the city because they needed workers. And, you know, this goes back like decades, but they needed workers. So who could take the train up to Lake Forest and Deerfield and Lake Bluff. But there are economic challenges here that are I don't see. argued for affordable housing in Glenview for the last 5 years. And there's, with the government, there's really not, there's always an excuse, but there's really not a willingness to integrate on an economic level.
Allison or Maria, either one of you want to comment?
Well, I just would say that there definitely is a intersection there with economics. And I think we're seeing that with some of the policies that are coming into examination. And so you're right. We need more of a mixture of housing that we can do through affordable housing and zoning changes and ordinances and things like that. And those are areas where you can be of assistance. And yes, we have to work on the perception issue. Listen, I grew up on the south side of Chicago, and I grew up at a time where, quite honestly, my parents told me things about the suburbs that you live in that really were never dispelled until I came back as an adult. And I went to some of those suburbs and I went, you know what, those people aren't all that but that was what my mother was honestly, literally afraid to drive me to those places. So and I'm saying this to you to say that the perceptions exist on both sides,
Yes.
right? And the only way that I know of to kind of break some of them down is through, my experience has been through going there, getting to know those people and seeing, wow, you know what? They're not all that bad.
Yep.
So I see two other hands and I'm going to get to you. I want to follow up on this just a little bit because I became aware of Maria and Allison through an article that I read that was published, I think, several years ago. And we used it in our research when we wrote a new position on housing and zoning in Evanston. And one of the things that I was fascinated by, which goes back to your original questions, Maria, when you started, was this notion of how do you find housing? And one of the things that fascinated me about that article was real estate agents. How do you ask them about neighborhoods and what do they know about neighborhoods and changing neighborhoods? And I've thought about that since the neighborhood I live in has changed dramatically over the last 10 years. And I'm wondering if real estate agents are aware of the change in the demographics, which have been so dramatic. So Maria, could you just add a little bit of some of the recommendations that you made in that article?
Allison, do you remember?
Do you remember?
Do you remember the recommendation? I think I want to jump in a little bit, and I think it gets a little bit at it. I think we've heard some reflections on the systemic challenges that we face, right? The economics one is a big one, and the perception one is they feel really big and really feel like you throw up your hands, right? Because how do you fix that? And I think that what I would like people to take from the framework that we put forward, which you could look at all of the framework and all of these causes of segregation and throw up your hands and give up because it feels overwhelming. But I like people to look at it instead as there's room here for everybody, right? There's a lot of ways. If there was one way to fix segregation, and I always add the inequities that flow from it, because I want to make sure I'm not saying, everybody has to live in a certain kind of neighborhood. I'm saying the inequities that we know are inherent in all of this. Chicago is a tale of three cities, right? There are at least three cities. And so I think that the complications, sociologists are famous for complicating everything. But I think in this case, the complication is a powerful tool for local, state, federal, like there's something for everyone in here to help to chip away at this. You can start with the personal breaking down your own stereotypes and perceptions of places that you've never been to. Go to a neighborhood you've never been to, get to know people in the neighborhood, learn that it's not as scary as you thought it was. And that goes for everybody. That doesn't go just for one group and the other group, it's everybody. And then there's ways in which you, through those realizations, you can start to see other ways you can chip away at this problem. If there was one solution, we would have done it a long time ago. There is not one solution. We did a lot of things for a lot of years, and we're still doing them, that are cementing these inequities into our city. And so not one thing is going to undo it all. But I think the powerful part of the model is to think about where you could intervene in this and help to disrupt the cycle, no matter how small and no matter how big. So that was a really graceful not answer to your direct question.
Well, one of the things,
Margaret, oh, I'm sorry.
I was just gonna say, one of the things I remember we talked about, though, we did suggest, Maria, was that HUD and others look at training and such for realtors, and how that might be improved. And you know, I'll be honest with you, it's a tough question, because you know, a lot of there's certainly a lot of concern that if realtors are talking about these things too, and particularly without good training and good knowledge, that they'll make the problem will get worse. But on the other hand, if we don't talk about it, we're still talking about it, right? I mean, we learned that, Maria, by not saying anything, you are saying something about the problem. So we need to have a dialogue, but exactly how we do that, I don't think we got on the answer.
Margaret. Unmute.
My question is for Allison, and it's a legal question. The categories of people who are protected by the law, does it include how many people can live in an apartment? So recently, our city fathers, in an effort to expand the ability of our senior citizens to stay in their expensive big houses with big real estate taxes, they reviewed the existing ordinance about how many non-related people can live in one house.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And they've come up with the number 5 now.
Mm-hmm.
So is Glenview going to be confronted with legal action from a family of 6 who is denied the ability to live upstairs from an elderly couple because they have one too many kids? Or
Yeah. So
is
you're raising the issue of occupancy restrictions,
yes,
Margaret. And while that's not a protected category, you know, under the law, but if you have occupancy restrictions, which almost all communities do, they can be illegal as applied to a particular situation. So you do have to look at each situation on its own facts, and depending on the size, the general standard is 2 persons per bedroom. But depending on the size and configuration, you know, of a unit, that standard may need to be waived or modified if the person needs a live-in caregiver or other reasons, you know, like that. So while that's not a protected category, the number of people in a unit in an apartment is regulated by communities. And those rules, you need to be careful about how you apply those rules.
Okay,
So in answer to your question, I'm not saying you will or will not be sued. Depends on how they're applied in a particular situation.
Dominic,
Yeah. Hello, Allison.
Hi.
How are you? And
Good.
hey, everybody. I'm glad to see Professor Bethel, who we work with closely. I was gonna ask a quick question. I don't know how much time we have or if we're at time this evening, but um, one of the things that I've been struggling with, well, it's a two-part question if I can be so greedy that one is regarding the outreach and education component around not just informing people what their rights are, but trying to change hearts and minds, as we always say, because without that, I think discrimination is going to perpetuate and continue, and that's one issue I was thinking about, and another issue in terms of what I always think of as a backdoor to discrimination is without any sort of regulation on credit and the ways in which credit is a proxy for discrimination. I sometimes wonder in some of the cases that we see at Open Communities, which is the organization I work for, where we see examples of, let's say, families who have a claim that they're being discriminated against, and perhaps the housing provider is confronted and they say, oh, well, actually it's the family's credit score that is disqualifying them from the housing, and that may be true by their codified rules, but we know the disparate impact that credit has. I do know that there is work in the disparate impact sort of sense of things, of people bringing cases or thinking about bringing cases under this. I'm just curious of those two things, of how much the hearts and minds fight matters versus just educating people on their rights, and then this very, very pernicious issue of credit score and how that becomes a backdoor for discrimination, and either for Allison or Maria.
Well, first of all, I want to say it's good to see you, and I think the work of Open Communities, which I think Jennifer had mentioned at the start, or someone mentioned at the start, is part of the reason why your area, why Evanston has had such a strong and good fair housing enforcement. Credit is, and frankly, for a long time has been an issue in minority communities, going all the way back really to rent to own and all those schemes that rob the communities of credit. And so, I've often thought we need really a multi-pronged approach with financial literacy from a very early stages to looking at the models of credit, which I know a lot of folks and often these people are looking at, because when you are struggling to pay bills, there's certain bills that you always pay, right? Like your rent and your utilities and this kind of thing. And so those aren't even factored into your credit score generally. So figuring out how we might better calculate credit scores is a way to maybe mitigate some of that loss. And then, while I know this may not necessarily be the most popular view, in my view, maybe everybody's not ready for ownership. And and maybe it needs to, it's a hard thing to accept. I know that's the dream, but if you're not ready for it, maybe the focus needs to be more on getting you ready for it, in terms of your income and so forth, and then being able to qualify. but credit is a problem, and as Dr. Creason said, there's so many systemic forces involved in that, the financial industry and such, that there's a role for all of us to play in that.
Yeah, I think the only thing. Oh,
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, just to add one little point that just reinforces what you said, Dominic, that, you know, discrimination, I mean, it keeps shape shifting, right? And so I think credit scores are an example for renters that have become like the vehicle through which discrimination happens, right? And I think there are people that are turning attention to credit scores. I mean, there are some landlords who don't use them, right? Who don't do eviction records, use them. There are some certain landlords that are doing this. And I think there are people sort of asking questions about this score, this number, right? There's all these people out there trying to make it so that the numbers aren't wrong, but it's like the numbers there make me, in this sort of high-tech world that we live in, that number has it's just taken on so much power. And I think of the other elements within the realm of segregation, numbers that we latch onto are also like the numbers associated with school ratings and how we decide, and the role of schools in the imagination of, because I don't think it's quite as much a driver as we think it is, but for certain settings, segregation is perpetuated by these perceptions of school quality, or school quality become the sort of assumption that people make about a community, and it's based on these numbers, and these numbers have become sort of reified. And there are interesting things happening with realtors in some communities around the country that are saying, we're going to step in because we're tired of these numbers driving everybody's perception of the school. There's more to a school than the number, because those numbers are deeply, just like credit scores, are deeply connected to the economic resources of the kids going to those schools, right? The relationship between test scores and income is just like very solid. So these realtors are coming in saying, you know, we're going to do a better job of talking about the schools, right? It's not just a number. There's a school over here that really specializes in the arts. So if you have a kid who wants to go to the arts, so the realtors themselves are saying, we want to have better information about schools. So I think you can sort of apply, it's a little bit loose. You're working with me, it's 8 o'clock at night, but you know, it's kind of the same thing. How can we go into the credit score world and say, no, enough is enough. This is not really the indicator you think it is, and challenge it and push back and try to create new models and metrics for assessing.
Sort of unusual bedfellows for a coalition, maybe, to make some policy change in the credit sphere. I mean, just really quickly, 10 seconds, I was just going to say, I mean, we were talking about disparate impact. We know that there is disparate impact based on credit score. We know that Black and brown people historically, you know, have lower credit scores because of a whole host of systemic and racist reasons. But yet it's this unchallengeable thing. When I talk to any of my colleagues in policymaking spaces, it's something you can't touch, because credit score is so embedded in the way that we establish risk, in the way that financial industry functions. And so, you know, I do think we all need to address that if we're going to fight this fight.
Kind of interesting that if you do look beyond just the score at what's owed, we used to try to convince, when I was working with the Housing Choice Voucher Program, convince landlords to not consider health charges, costs, and student loans. And if you eliminate those two things, which has been shown clearly have very little to do with whether people pay their rent or their mortgage, then you go a long way toward solving that problem. We have a question in the chat. Oh, it's kind of a biggie. How do zoning boards contribute to housing discrimination, and how do you suggest we change it?
Yeah, this is Christine. My question is, yeah, that was my question. And maybe the makeup of zoning boards, maybe I don't know enough about zoning boards. Is it mostly business people, attorneys, wealthy people? I mean, are they appointed a lot of the times? You know, how do we change that to make zoning more, you know, that's my basic question.
I have nothing smart to say except to say that, like, that's the kind of zoning boards and tax policies, right? Those two things are like the ginormous yawners, and they're so technical, but they have been shown time and again to be powerful instruments of all of these inequities that are playing themselves out. Historically, zoning boards have played a role. There are people that are trying to change zoning boards, but that's like the extent of my knowledge of zoning. Maybe Allison or Dominic maybe knows more, but it's a great question, and it's a great place to look for the clever ways that segregation and inequities continue to be perpetuated, because they set us up, right? Homes can only be this big, and you can only live here in this town if you have $1 billion to buy. Okay, that's a little exaggeration. It's late at night, but if you have a whole bunch of money to be able to buy that house, and that's a zoning decision, right? And that's what fair housing people have been pushing. People have been pushing who care about this for a good. It's nice to see, but I'm sure there's still more work to be done.
As a matter of fact, the good news is that Evanston is looking at its zoning code and pretty carefully. And I think that joining forces for affordable housing and open communities and other advocates in the vicinity have looked at our zoning code and done some reviews, even had an independent consultant come and do a study. So I think that we will see changes in the coming year or two.
Yeah, no, that's a huge, everything. This
It
is,
is huge.
and you know, my hat, if I had one, is off to you for looking at that. It's a huge part of the problem and of the solution.
And to the extent that you can get your friends in Wilmette and Glenview to join in, right? I mean, you know, there are a couple of communities in the region, we all know what they are, that are doing these kinds of things, but it's an island in a sea of segregation that you gotta, you know, there are regional solutions too, but we need to start getting the regions to start talking to each other. So, but it starts at home. Evanston, setting the stage, get some more friends in the boat with you, mixing metaphors with abandon.
Okay, last question, Susan.
So Kathy Cortez and I have started a regional housing coalition in the north suburbs. So if you are interested in joining us, we just meet quarterly on Zoom to see where progress is made or what the challenges are, or share the learnings and the studies we've done. So if you want to contact me, it's sgregnew@gmail.com. We would love to have more participation from the city, from other suburbs in the county. We want to see where incremental progress is made, and also what are the challenges in different parts, political, you know, social. And so we're going to have a meeting on November 29th. And if you would like to participate in that, just email me. And
Susan, are you talking about the League Coalition?
yes, it is.
The regional coalition.
League of Women Voters Coalition.
I will get that information out to everyone because I was so pleased that we had several people sign up for this evening from that group. I want to thank you all for being with us tonight. We will be doing a follow-up probably in April during Fair Housing Month. And that will be probably a little bit more Evanston specific, but we hope by then that our local project will be pretty much completed, and we can bring some information of what we learned as we get around the neighborhood, the community, and talk with people and do interviews. So tonight has been just a wonderful framework for us to work with. And Maria and Allison, I thank you so much for coming.
Thank you for having us.
Thank
The
you.
rest of you will be in touch.
Thanks,
All right.
Allison. Thanks,
Good night,
Maria.
Thank you all for coming.
Thanks, Jennifer. Take care, everybody. Have a good night.